When a group of bikers surrounded a man and his tiny dog at a gas station, they thought they had the upper hand. After all, he looked harmless in his hoodie, but the moment they kicked his dog, the situation flipped. What they didn't know was that this harmless man was an ex-Green Beret sniper, and he was about to teach them a brutal lesson they'd never forget. The sun dipped low over the quiet streets of Los Angeles, casting a warm golden hue on the sidewalks. The gentle hum of distant traffic mixed with the chirping of birds settling. In for the night. Jason Statham adjusted his grey hoodie as he stepped out of his house, trying to blend in. Beside him, his wife, Rosie Huntington Whiteley, smiled warmly, holding the leashes of their two miniature dachshunds, Dolly and Peggy. The tiny dogs trotted eagerly, their small paws clicking rhythmically against the pavement. To any passerby, it looked like a normal, peaceful evening walk, but Jason's instincts told him something felt off. Jason glanced at Rosie, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you sure this is a good idea?" he asked, his voice low. Years of military training had sharpened his instincts, and right now, those instincts were whispering warnings in his ear. But Rosie just laughed, brushing off his worry with a wave of her hand. "Jason, it's just a quick walk to the gas station. What's the worst that could happen?" Jason gave a tight smile, but his eyes never stopped scanning their surroundings. Even in retirement, the ex-Green Beret sniper couldn't switch off the habits that had kept him alive in hostile territory. Rosie tugged gently on the leashes as Dolly and Peggy sniffed every bush and lamppost along the way. "They've been cooped up all day," she said with a soft chuckle. "They need this." Jason nodded, though his gaze remained sharp. The tiny dachshunds were more than just pets. They were family. Dolly, with her playful bark, and Peggy, the more cautious one, had become a source of joy in their lives. But Jason knew all too well how quickly joy could turn into tragedy. And tonight, he wasn't taking any chances. As they neared the gas station, the peaceful evening air grew heavier. The distant hum of engines grew louder, and Jason's eyes darted to the corner of the street. Two Harley motorcycles appeared, roaring past them with deafening noise. The riders, both burly and clad in leather, sneered as they passed, their eyes lingering a little too long on Jason and his family. One of them shouted over the engine's roar, "Hey, nice mop dogs!" The words hung in the air, thick and ugly. Jason's jaw clenched. Rosie tightened her grip on the leashes, casting a nervous glance at her husband. "Ignore them," she whispered, but Jason's instinct screamed otherwise. He knew men like this, and he knew this wasn't over. The tension in the air thickened as Jason and Rosie continued their walk toward the gas station. The taunts from the bikers echoed in Jason's mind, but he kept his composure. Years of training had taught him the importance of patience and observation. Still, his protective instincts were on high alert. He subtly shifted his position, placing himself between Rosie and the road, his body acting as a shield. The miniature, dachshunds Dolly and Peggy, remained blissfully unaware of the growing tension, their little tails wagging as they trotted along. As they rounded the corner, the gas station came into view, its fluorescent lights flickering in the encroaching dusk. But what should have been a quick, uneventful stop was about to take a dangerous turn. Parked at the edge of the lot were the two Harley motorcycles, their chrome gleaming under the harsh lights. The bikers leaned against their bikes, cigarettes dangling from their lips, exhaling plumes of smoke into the evening air. Their eyes locked onto Jason and his family the moment they stepped into the gas station's vicinity. Jason felt Rosie stiffen beside him. "Maybe we should turn back," she whispered, her voice tinged with unease. Jason shook his head, his eyes never leaving the bikers. "We've come this far," he replied calmly, though his muscles were coiled, ready to spring into action. If needed, he guided Rosie closer, keeping his tone light. "Just stick close to me. As they approached the entrance, one of the bikers, a burly man with a thick beard and a menacing grin, stepped forward, deliberately blocking their path. His leather jacket bore the insignia of a snarling wolf, and his eyes gleamed with a mix of malice and amusement. "Well, well, look who's back," he sneered, his voice rough like gravel. "Didn't think you'd have the guts to show up again with your little mop dogs." Jason's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. "We're just here to get some supplies," he said evenly, his voice low but firm. He tried to steer Rosie around the man, but the biker wasn't about to let them pass so easily. His companion, a lanky man with a snake tattoo coiling around his neck, chuckled darkly and flicked his cigarette to the ground, grinding it under his boot. "You sure those mutts belong here?" The second biker jeered, his eyes narrowing as he eyed the dachshunds. "They look like they belong in a dollhouse, not on the streets." The first biker stepped closer, his bulk looming over Rosie and the dogs. Without warning, he lashed out with his foot, aiming a cruel kick at Peggy. The little dog yelped in pain, stumbling back as Rosie gasped in horror. That was the final straw. Before the biker could react, Jason moved. In one swift, fluid motion, he grabbed the man by the front of his jacket and slammed him against the wall of the gas station. The biker's eyes widened in shock as Jason's face hovered inches from his voice a deadly whisper. "You picked the wrong family to mess with," Jason growled, his grip tightening. The biker struggled, but Jason's strength was overwhelming. The second biker stepped forward, but Jason shot him a glare so cold and fierce that he froze in his tracks. Rosie, still shaken, knelt beside Peggy, gently checking the dog for injuries. Dolly stood protectively by her side, her tiny body trembling with a mix of fear and defiance. "She's okay," Rosie whispered, relief flooding her voice, but her eyes were still wide with fear. Jason released the biker with a shove, sending him sprawling to the ground. "Stay away from us," Jason warned, his voice icy. "Next time you won't get off so easy." He didn't wait for a response. Taking Rosie's hand, he guided her and the dogs into the gas station, leaving the bikers fuming in the parking lot. Inside, the bright lights felt almost blinding after the confrontation outside. The cashier, a young man with wide eyes, had clearly witnessed the altercation. He watched them nervously as they approached the counter. "Everything okay out there?" he asked hesitantly. Jason nodded curtly. "It's under control," he said, his voice calm but firm. Rosie gathered the batteries they needed, her hands still trembling slightly. Dolly and Peggy stayed close to her feet, their earlier enthusiasm dampened by the encounter. As they paid for their items, the cashier leaned in slightly. "Those guys, they've been causing trouble around here for weeks," he whispered. "You might want to be careful when you leave." Jason gave a small nod, appreciating the warning but fully aware of the danger. With their supplies in hand, Jason and Rosie stepped back into the night, the cool air feeling heavy with tension. The bikers were still there, their eyes filled with rage and humiliation. As Jason and his family walked past, the first biker snarled, "This isn't over, pretty boy. We'll see you around." Jason didn't respond. He kept his gaze forward, his posture relaxed but ready for anything, but deep down he knew this was far from over. The bikers had crossed a line, and they weren't the type to let go of a grudge easily. As they made their way home, Jason's mind raced with possibilities. He had dealt with threats before, but this time it was personal. They had threatened his family, and Jason Statham wasn't about to let that slide. As the familiar streets of their neighborhood came into view, Rosie finally broke the silence. "Jason, what are we going to do?" Her voice was soft, but Jason could hear the fear behind her words. Jason took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the shadows. "We're going to be ready," he replied quietly. "If they come for us, they'll regret it." His voice was calm, but the steel in his tone left no room for doubt. Jason Statham was many things: a husband, a dog owner, a man trying to enjoy a peaceful life. But above all, he was a protector, and anyone who threatened his family was about to find out just how dangerous that could be. The uneasy calm of their neighborhood felt more fragile than ever as Jason and Rosie approached. Their home, the dogs, usually bubbling with energy, were unusually subdued, their small frames huddled close to their owner's legs. The shadows cast by the streetlights stretched long and eerie across the pavement, amplifying the sense of looming danger. Jason's mind raced through the events at the gas station, each detail etched sharply in his memory. He knew the bikers would not let the humiliation go unanswered. He had seen that kind of pride before, the dangerous kind that festers until it explodes. Inside their home, the familiar surroundings offered little comfort. Jason double-checked the locks on all doors and windows, his military training kicking in as he secured their home like a fortress. Rosie watched him silently, her heart heavy with worry. She had seen Jason in action before, in his films and on set. But this was different. This was real. Their lives were no longer following a script, and the stakes were terrifyingly high. As Jason paced the living room, Rosie finally broke the tense silence. "Jason, what if they come here? What if they try to hurt us? Or the dogs?" Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady, searching his face for reassurance. Jason stopped and looked at her, his expression softening. He crossed the room and took her hands in his. "They won't get that chance," he said firmly. "I'll make sure of it." His words were simple, but the conviction behind them was undeniable. Rosie nodded, trusting him, but the fear lingered like a shadow in the corners of her mind. That night, sleep was elusive. Jason lay awake, listening to every creak and groan of the house, his senses heightened by the adrenaline still coursing through his veins. Rosie eventually drifted into a restless sleep, but Jason remained alert, his mind formulating a plan. He knew waiting for the bikers to make the next move was a mistake. He needed to take control of the situation, to confront the threat head-on, before it reached their doorstep. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Jason had made his decision. He gently woke Rosie, his voice a whisper in the early morning stillness. "I need to take care of this," he said. "I'll be back soon. Keep the doors locked and don't open them for anyone but me." Rosie sat up, her eyes wide with concern. "Jason, please be careful," she pleaded. "We should call the police." Jason shook his head. "The police can't help with this, not in time. I know how to handle them." He kissed her forehead softly, then knelt to give Dolly and Peggy a gentle pat. "You girls be good and protect your mum, okay?" The dogs wagged their tails weakly, sensing the tension, but comforted by his touch. Jason left the house, his steps silent on the pavement as he made his way through the quiet streets. The address the cashier had given him echoed in his mind. He knew where to find them. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about sending a message that messing with his family came with consequences. The biker clubhouse was easy to spot. It stood at the edge of town, a large run-down building with motorcycles parked haphazardly out front. The snarling wolf insignia on the gate left no doubt about who it belonged to. Jason approached with caution, his eyes scanning every detail, every possible exit. He wasn't looking for a fight, but he was prepared for one. He rang the buzzer at the gate, his heart steady as the intercom crackled to life. "Who the hell is it?" a gruff voice demanded. "Jason Statham," he replied calmly. "I'm here to settle things." There was a pause, followed by a burst of laughter. "You've got guts, Statham. Come on in." The gate creaked open slowly, and Jason stepped inside, his muscles coiled and ready for whatever awaited him. Inside, the clubhouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of gasoline and stale beer. The bikers lounged around, their conversations dying off as they noticed Jason. Tucker and Vince were there, their faces twisting into sneers as they recognized him. But Jason's attention was focused on the man sitting at the head of the room, a large, imposing figure with a scar running down the side of his face. The man stood, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jason. "I'm Pre," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "What do you want, Statham?" Jason didn't flinch. He met Pre's gaze squarely. "I'm here because your men crossed a line," he said evenly. "They harassed my wife, tried to hurt my dogs. I'm not here to talk this out. I'm here to make sure it doesn't happen again." The room was silent for a moment before Tucker barked out a laugh. "You think you can come in here and threaten us?" he sneered. "You're just an actor." Jason's eyes flicked to Tucker, his expression icy. "An actor who knows exactly how to deal with people like you." Pre raised a hand, silencing Tucker. He stepped closer to Jason, his eyes never leaving his. "You've got guts," he said slowly. "I respect that, but you're in our territory now. You think you can scare us?" Jason didn't waver. "I don't need to scare you," he replied. "I just need you to understand that if you come near my family again, there won't be a next time." For a long moment, the two men stared at each other, the tension crackling like static in the air. Then, to everyone's surprise, Pre chuckled. "You've got fire, Statham. I like that. But you've also got guts showing up here alone." Jason's lips curled into a slight smile. "Who said I'm alone?" The words hung in the air, their meaning sinking in as the bikers glanced around nervously. Jason knew how to play the psychological game, to plant seeds of doubt and fear. He didn't need an army, just the belief that he might have one was enough. Pre finally nodded, a grudging respect in his eyes. "All right," he said. "You've made your point. Tucker and Vince were out of line. We'll handle them. But you'd better hope we don't cross paths again." Jason nodded once, satisfied. "That's all I needed to hear." Without another word, he turned and walked out of the clubhouse, leaving the bikers to their whispered conversations and uneasy glances. As Jason made his way home, the adrenaline slowly faded, replaced by a calm resolve. The threat had been neutralized, at least for now, but Jason knew better than to let his guard down completely. He had sent a message loud and clear, and he was ready for whatever came next. Back home, Rosie rushed to the door the moment he stepped inside, relief flooding her face. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jason pulled her into a tight embrace. "I'm fine," he whispered. "It's over. For now." The next morning, the sun rose over Los Angeles, casting golden hues across the quiet streets. But inside Jason and Rosie's home, the atmosphere remained tense, the events of the previous day still heavy in the air. Jason sat at the kitchen table sipping his coffee, while Rosie moved around the room, her movements sharp with lingering anxiety. Dolly and Peggy, sensing the unease, lay quietly at their feet, their usual playful energy subdued. Jason's phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. He glanced at the screen and saw an unknown number. His instincts sharpened immediately. With a quick glance at Rosie, he answered the call, his voice calm but alert. "Statham," a deep voice growled on the other end, one Jason instantly recognized as Pre's. "Thought you should know. Tucker and Vince didn't take kindly to being kicked out. They've been stirring up trouble, and it's got nothing to do with us anymore." Jason's grip on the phone tightened. "What kind of trouble?" "They're talking about payback," Pre replied, his tone serious. "Not just for you, but for anyone who crosses them. Word is, they've teamed up with another gang, and they're planning something big." Jason's jaw clenched. He had hoped his confrontation at the clubhouse had ended things, but it was clear this wasn't over. "Thanks for the heads up," he said curtly, ending the call. Rosie, who had been watching him closely, crossed the room. "What's going on, Jason?" she asked, her voice low but steady. Jason met her gaze, his expression hardening. "Tucker and Vince aren't done. They're planning something, and it's bigger than just us. Rosie's face paled, but she nodded, her trust in Jason unwavering. "What do we do now?" Jason stood, his military precision kicking in. "We stay alert. We're not running, but we're going to be ready for whatever they throw at us." Just as he finished speaking, there was a sharp knock at the door. Both Jason and Rosie froze, their eyes meeting in silent understanding. Jason motioned for Rosie to take the dogs to the back room while he approached the door cautiously. Peering through the peephole, he saw a familiar face. It was Mike, the cashier from the gas station. Jason opened the door slightly, keeping the chain locked. "Mike, what are you doing here?" Mike's eyes darted around nervously before he spoke. "I didn't know where else to go. I overheard something last night. Those bikers, Tucker and Vince, they were talking about you. They said they know where you live. I thought you should—" "No." Jason's mind raced. This confirmed what Pri had told him. He nodded, appreciating the young man's courage. "Thanks for letting me know, Mike. You should be careful too. They won't like that you warned me." Mike swallowed hard, but nodded. "I will. Just watch your back, Mr. Statham." As Jason closed the door, locking it securely, he turned back to Rosie, who had returned to the living room with the dogs. "It's time to end this," he said, his voice low and resolute. Rosie's eyes flashed with worry, but she knew arguing would be pointless. Jason wasn't just protecting her and the dogs. He was protecting their peace, their home. She stepped closer, placing a hand on his arm. "Just promise me you'll come back safe." Jason nodded, his hand covering hers briefly. "I will." That evening, as the city lights flickered on and the streets grew quieter, Jason prepared for what he knew would be a final confrontation. He wasn't just an actor playing tough roles. He was a former military man with the skills and experience to handle threats like Tucker and Vince. But this time, it was personal. Jason drove to the location Pri had hinted at, a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, known for illegal activities and gang meetings. He parked a few blocks away and approached on foot, his senses sharp and his mind focused. The warehouse loomed ahead, dimly lit and surrounded by motorcycles. Jason could hear voices inside, rough laughter and the occasional shout. Slipping into the shadows, Jason found a vantage point near a broken window. Peering inside, he saw Tucker and Vince surrounded by a new group of bikers, their faces twisted with anger and malice. Tucker slammed his fist on a table, his voice carrying through the space. "That bastard thinks he can humiliate us? We'll show him. We'll burn his house down, take everything he loves. Let's see how tough he is then." Jason felt a surge of cold fury. This wasn't just about him anymore. They were threatening his family, his home. He knew he had to act fast. Slipping back into the darkness, Jason pulled out his phone and dialed Pri. "They're at the old warehouse," he whispered. "You said you wanted to make things right. Now's your chance." Pri's voice was firm. "We're on our way." Minutes later, the sound of roaring engines filled the night as Pri and his crew arrived, surrounding the warehouse. Jason moved swiftly, slipping inside through a side entrance while the bikers outside created a distraction. Chaos erupted as Pri's crew confronted Tucker and Vince's new gang, the sound of shouts and scuffles echoing through the warehouse. Amid the confusion, Jason found Tucker and Vince trying to slip out the back. Stepping into their path, he faced them, his presence like a shadow of inevitable reckoning. Tucker's eyes widened in shock. "You!" Jason didn't waste words. With precise, controlled movements, he disarmed Vince and took Tucker down with a swift blow, pinning him to the ground. "You crossed the line," Jason growled, "and now you're going to pay." By the time the police arrived, tipped off anonymously by Jason, the fight was over. Tucker and Vince were arrested, along with several members of their new gang. Pri and his crew faded into the night, their message delivered. Jason returned. Home just before dawn, exhausted but victorious. Rosie met him at the door, her relief palpable as she threw her arms around him. Dolly and Peggy barked happily, their tails wagging furiously. "It's over," Jason whispered, holding Rosie. "Close. They're gone." Rosie pulled back slightly, searching his face. "Are you sure?" Jason nodded, his heart finally at ease. "I'm sure." As the first rays of sunlight filtered through their windows, Jason and Rosie sat on the couch with their dogs, the tension of the past days slowly melting away. They had faced the threat together, and now they could finally breathe easy. Sometimes, Jason realized, the greatest battles weren't fought on movie sets or in scripted scenes. They were fought in the quiet streets of home, where love and family were the stakes. And those were the battles worth winning. As night fell over Los Angeles, an uneasy calm settled over Jason and Rosie's neighborhood. But inside their home, tension crackled like a live wire. Jason paced the living room, his sharp eyes constantly darting toward the window, scanning the quiet street outside. Rosie sat on the couch with Dolly and Peggy nestled in her lap, her face pale but determined. They both knew this wasn't over. Tucker and Vince were out there, plotting revenge. And Jason was ready. Suddenly, the shrill ring of Jason's phone shattered the silence. He snatched it up, his muscles tensing as he read the message. It was from Pri. "They're coming tonight. Be ready." Jason's jaw tightened. The time for waiting was over. He turned to Rosie. "It's happening tonight. You and the dogs stay in the basement, lock the door. Do not come out until I get you." Rosie's eyes widened with fear, but she nodded. She knew better than to argue. She gathered Dolly and Peggy, kissing Jason quickly before disappearing down the stairs. Jason waited until he heard the heavy click of the basement lock before springing into action. He moved through the house like a shadow, checking every lock, every window. Then he headed to the garage. Pulling back a dusty tarp, he revealed a hidden cache of weapons and tactical gear, a remnant of his days in the military, locked away for a moment just like this. Jason strapped on a bulletproof vest, slid a combat knife into his boot, and holstered a pistol at his side. But he knew brute force wouldn't be enough. Tucker and Vince were reckless, but they weren't stupid. They would come prepared, and Jason needed to outthink them. He killed all the lights in the house, plunging it into darkness. Then he set traps at every entrance, a tripwire near the back door, broken glass scattered by the front porch, and a makeshift alarm rigged to the garage. Jason knew the layout of his home like the back of his hand, and in the dark it would be his greatest weapon. Hours passed. The house was silent, save for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then Jason heard it, the low rumble of motorcycles in the distance, growing louder by the second. They were here. Jason crouched by the front window, peeking through the blinds as the headlights of 4 motorcycles cut through the night. Tucker and Vince had brought reinforcements, 2 more bikers, both just as rough and dangerous-looking as them. The gang dismounted, their boots crunching on the gravel as they approached the house. Jason's heart pounded, but his mind was razor-sharp. He waited, watching as they split up, 2 heading toward the front, 2 circling around the back. They were trying to flank him, but Jason was ready. Suddenly there was a loud crack as one of the bikers triggered the tripwire at the back door. A metal pipe swung down from the rafters, slamming into his chest and sending him sprawling. Jason smiled grimly. 1 down. But the noise had alerted the others. Tucker and Vince charged the front door, kicking it open with a splintering crash. Jason was already in motion, slipping through the shadows like a ghost. He met Vince in the hallway, catching him off guard. With a swift, precise movement, Jason slammed his elbow into Vince's face, shattering his nose. Vince roared in pain, swinging wildly, but Jason ducked under the punch and delivered a brutal kick to his knee, sending him crashing to the floor. Before Jason could finish him off, Tucker barreled into him from behind, tackling him to the ground. The two men grappled fiercely, fists flying in a blur of motion. Tucker was bigger, but Jason was faster, more disciplined. He twisted out of Tucker's grip, landing a series of rapid blows to his ribs, but Tucker wasn't going down that easily. He pulled a knife from his belt, slashing at Jason with wild, vicious swings. Jason narrowly dodged the blade, feeling it graze his arm. Ignoring the sting, he focused on Tucker's movements, waiting for the perfect opening. It came a moment. Later, Tucker lunged forward, overcommitting to a stab. Jason sidestepped, grabbing Tucker's wrist and twisting it until the knife clattered to the floor. With a final powerful punch, Jason sent Tucker sprawling across the room, unconscious. But the fight wasn't over. A gunshot rang out, echoing through the house. Jason dove behind the couch as bullets ripped through the air, splintering wood and shattering glass. One of the bikers had a pistol, and he wasn't afraid to use it. Jason crawled through the shadows, moving silently toward the source of the gunfire. He spotted the shooter near the kitchen, his back turned as he reloaded. Jason seized the opportunity, lunging forward and disarming the biker in one swift motion. They struggled briefly, but Jason's military training gave him the upper hand. He slammed the biker's head against the counter, knocking him out cold. Breathing heavily, Jason scanned the room. 3 down, 1 to go. But where was Vince? A sudden, chilling realization hit Jason like a punch to the gut. Vince wasn't in the house anymore. He was after Rosie. Jason sprinted toward the basement door, his heart pounding with fear. He reached it just in time to hear Rosie's scream from below. Without hesitation, he kicked the door open and charged down the stairs. The basement was dimly lit, but Jason could see Vince towering over Rosie, his hand wrapped around her arm. Dolly and Peggy barked furiously at his feet, their tiny bodies trembling with fear. "Let her go!" Jason roared, his voice echoing off the concrete walls. Vince sneered, tightening his grip on Rosie. "Or what, Statham? You gonna shoot me? You're not that kind of hero." Jason didn't waste time with words. He moved like lightning, crossing the room in seconds. Vince tried to swing at him, but Jason ducked under the punch and drove his fist into Vince's stomach, forcing him to release Rosie. As Rosie scrambled to safety with the dogs, Jason and Vince clashed in a brutal, no-holds-barred fight. Vince was desperate, fighting with the strength of a cornered animal, but Jason was relentless. He dodged Vince's wild swings, countering with precise punishing blows. Finally, Jason pinned Vince against the wall, his forearm pressing against his throat. "This is for my family," Jason growled, before delivering a final devastating punch that sent Vince collapsing to the floor, unconscious. The room fell silent, save for the ragged sound of Jason's breathing. Rosie rushed to his side, her eyes wide with relief. Dolly and Peggy barked excitedly, their tails wagging despite the chaos. "It's over," Jason whispered, pulling Rosie into his arms. "They're gone." But just as he spoke, the sound of sirens filled the air. The police had arrived, tipped off by Pri, who had been watching from a distance to ensure things didn't spiral out of control. As the officers stormed the house, arresting the unconscious bikers, Jason and Rosie stood together, holding their dogs close. They had faced the worst and come out stronger, their bond unbreakable. Later, as the police cleared the scene and the house fell quiet once more, Jason and Rosie sat on the couch, exhausted but safe. Dolly and Peggy curled up between them, their tiny bodies warm and comforting. Jason looked at Rosie, a small smile playing on his lips. "Next time we need batteries," he said softly. "We're ordering them online." Rosie laughed, the sound bright and full of relief. "Deal!" As the first light of dawn crept through the windows, Jason knew they had won more than just a fight. They had reclaimed their peace, their home, and their family. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The morning sun rose slowly over Los Angeles, casting a golden glow over the quiet neighborhood that had just hours ago been the scene of chaos and violence. Jason and Rosie sat on their front porch, wrapped in a shared blanket, their faces tired but content. Between them, Dolly and Peggy lay curled up, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each peaceful breath. The street, once a battleground, now seemed almost serene, as if the night's events had been nothing more than a bad dream, but Jason and Rosie knew better. The aftermath of the confrontation had been swift. The police, alerted by Pree's anonymous tip, arrived just in time to apprehend Tucker, Vince, and their accomplices. The bikers, once so confident and full of bravado, were now reduced to humiliated handcuffed criminals being loaded into squad cars under the harsh glare of flashing lights. Neighbors had gathered, their sleepy faces turning to shock, and then relief as they realized the source of the commotion. The once quiet street was now buzzing with whispered conversations and curious glances directed at Jason and Rosie's home. Detective Harris, a tall, no-nonsense woman with sharp eyes, had taken their statements. She listened carefully as Jason recounted the events, nodding occasionally and scribbling notes in her worn notebook. When he finished, she closed the notebook with a snap and gave Jason a look of sincere respect. "You handled yourself well, Mr. Statham," she said, her voice firm but kind. "But next time maybe give us a call before things get this far." Jason chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I'll keep that in mind, Detective." As the police cars pulled away, taking the remnants of the Iron Wolves with them, a strange calm settled over Jason and Rosie's home. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind a heavy exhaustion. But it was more than just physical fatigue. It was the weight of everything they'd faced and the knowledge that for now they were safe. Now, as they sat on the porch, sipping coffee and watching the sun climb higher in the sky, the reality of the night's events began to sink in. Rosie broke the silence first, her voice soft and thoughtful. "Do you think it's really over?" she asked, her eyes still fixed on the horizon. Jason considered her question for a moment before answering. "I think so," he said quietly. "Tucker and Vince won't be bothering us anymore, and Pree made it clear the rest of the club doesn't stand for that kind of behavior." Rosie nodded, but the worry in her eyes lingered. She reached down to stroke Peggy's soft fur, finding comfort in the familiar, rhythmic motion. I never thought we'd be in a situation like this. I mean, who kicks a dog for fun? And then to find out it's you they messed with. It's like something out of a movie." Jason chuckled softly, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "Yeah, but this time there were no stunt doubles." Rosie laughed, the sound lightening the mood. She leaned her head against Jason's shoulder, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath the fabric of his hoodie. "You know," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper, "for a guy who's fought off international terrorists and saved the world more times than I can count, you're pretty great at being a dog dad." Jason smiled, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "Thanks. I've had good teachers," he replied, nodding toward Dolly and Peggy, who were now snoring softly between them. The day unfolded slowly, allowing Jason and Rosie to settle back into their routine. But even as they went about their day, the events of the previous night lingered in their minds. The house, once their sanctuary, felt different now. The scars of the battle were visible, splintered door frames, broken glass, and the faint scent of gunpowder still clinging to the air. But there was also a sense of triumph, of having faced danger and come out stronger on the other side. That afternoon, as Jason was repairing the front door, there was a knock at the gate. He tensed instinctively, but when he looked up he saw a familiar face. Pree stood there, his imposing figure framed by the bright sunlight, but his expression was one of genuine contrition. Jason set down his tools and walked over, opening the gate. "Pree," he greeted, his tone neutral but not unfriendly. "Didn't expect to see you here." Pree nodded, his eyes serious. "I just wanted to make things right," he said. He held out a small, neatly wrapped package. "For your dogs." "And for the trouble we caused," Jason raised an eyebrow but accepted the package. His curiosity piqued. He opened it to find two custom-made leather collars, each engraved with Dolly and Peggy's names, along with the phrase, "Fearless and loved." A small smile tugged at Jason's lips. "They're beautiful," he said, his voice softening. "Thank you." Pre nodded, his expression earnest. "We don't all stand for what Tucker and Vince did. Most of us love our dogs like family. What they did, it's not who we are." Jason studied Prey for a moment, then extended his hand. "I believe you, and I appreciate you coming by." They shook hands, the gesture sealing an unspoken truce. As Pre turned to leave, he called over his shoulder, "And if you ever want to bring the girls by for a play date, my bulldog would love the company." Jason chuckled, watching him walk away. The idea of a play date with a biker's bulldog was absurd, and yet somehow it felt like the perfect way to move forward. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jason and Rosie sat in the living room, the new collars gleaming on Dolly and Peggy as they played on the rug. The house was quieter now, the tension of the past day finally easing into a peaceful calm. Rosie looked over at Jason, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the fireplace. "Do you think things will ever go back to normal?" she asked. Jason thought about it for a moment, then shook his head. "No," he said simply, "but maybe that's not a bad thing." Rosie nodded, understanding what he meant. They had faced something terrible, but they had come out of it stronger, more connected. Their quiet life had been shattered, but in its place was a deeper appreciation for what they had, a family, love, and the resilience to overcome anything together. As they sat there, wrapped in each other's arms, Dolly and Peggy curled up at their feet, Jason felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had faced danger and come out the other side not just unscathed, but stronger. And in the end, that was all that mattered. Rosie leaned in, kissing Jason softly on the cheek. "Next time," she whispered, "we're definitely ordering the batteries online." Jason laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "Deal," he said, pulling her closer. And as the night wrapped around them like a comforting blanket, Jason knew that no matter what challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as a family. Justice had been served. Their home was safe, and their hearts were full. And in that moment, everything felt exactly as it should. As the days passed and life gradually returned to normal, Jason found himself reflecting more deeply on the events that had unfolded. The adrenaline had long since faded, replaced by a quiet introspection. Sitting on the porch one evening, the cool breeze rustling through the trees, he watched Dolly and Peggy chase each other across the yard, their playful barks echoing in the twilight. Rosie joined him, a cup of tea in her hand, and together they sat in comfortable silence, the weight of recent events lingering in the air like a distant memory. Breaking the silence, Jason spoke softly, his voice tinged with both weariness and wisdom. "You know, Rosie," he began, "I've faced a lot of challenges in my life, on and off the screen. But nothing quite compares to the fear of seeing someone you love in danger. It's not about being tough or knowing how to fight. It's about protecting what matters most." Rosie nodded, her gaze following the dogs as they tumbled in the grass. "It's funny," she mused, "how the smallest things can bring out the fiercest parts of us. I mean, they're just tiny dogs, but the thought of anyone hurting them..." Her voice trailed off, the emotion lingering in the space between them. Jason reached over, taking her hand in his. "It's not about their size," he said gently. "It's about the love we have for them, for each other. When you care about someone that deeply, you don't hesitate. You stand up, you fight, even if the odds seem impossible." Rosie squeezed his hand, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I'm proud of you, Jason. Not just for what you did, but for the way you did it. You didn't just protect us. You stood up for what's right." Jason smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. "I learned something important through all this," he admitted. "It's not enough to be strong. True strength is knowing when to fight and when to walk away. It's about standing up for those who can't defend themselves, not because you want recognition, but because it's the right thing to do." They sat in thoughtful silence for a moment, the fading light casting long shadows across the yard. The world had shown them its darker side, but it had also revealed unexpected kindness, like Pri and the members of the biker club who had chosen to do the right thing when it mattered most. Rosie's voice broke the silence, soft but steady. "I think that's the lesson, isn't it? We can't control what others do, but we can control how we respond. We can choose to be brave, to be kind, to stand up for what's right, even when it's hard." Jason nodded, his gaze fixed on the horizon where the last light of day was slipping away. "Yeah," he agreed quietly, "and no matter how tough things get, we'll face them together. Because at the end of the day, that's what matters most." As night settled around them, Jason and Rosie sat side by side, the warmth of their love and the strength of their bond a beacon in the darkness. They had faced fear and danger, but they had emerged stronger, more resilient. And in that quiet moment, surrounded by the simple joys of home and family, they knew they could weather any storm as long as they stood together.